Hi, everyone, and good morning. I welcome to the session Making Meaning, a Memoir. Now, if you have any questions for the presenters, please type them in the chat box. We will address them during the Q&A session, during the presentation, and at the end of the presentation. It is my honor now to introduce Dr. Batya Weinbaum. Take it away, Dr. Weinbaum.
Thank you. I can't see anyone's faces except ours. Are there
It's
other people?
they're listening, but you can't see the faces.
Oh, okay. That's why I thought there was nobody here. Okay. So this is a memoir that I just finished. It's called Making Meaning, a memoir, and most of it is about my intellectual history and things I've written. And I got my PhD in English in '96, but I had a long writing career before then. So probably you're going to find things out about me that you don't know. So this is chapter 3, Visions, Radical Intellectual Post-Rape and Women's Liberation. The time in my life when I most had a vision propelling me forward had to have been my early days in New York City. I had come back from South America, to which I had run because in Boston, where I was living, I had been raped when I was hitchhiking from Harvard Square to Symphony Road one cold winter night. After this experience in which I was drugged and gang raped, I wanted to go as far away as possible, typical of rape victims, and the furthest place I knew was Chile. I was seeking meaning in my life. My sense of meaning had been shattered by the brutal assault, after which I had contracted gonorrhea. My world was so shattered that I was struggling to find a reason to stay alive. I had a book when I came back to give to someone named David Barkin, a radical political economist in an organization with which I became involved. At a party on the Upper West Side, where David had invited me to meet him, I found a hotbed of radical intellectuals. I joined right in and began talking about what I had seen throughout Latin America: desperate poverty, Bolivian tin miners dying in the hospitals, telling me to tell the UN and UNICEF that the mining companies were killing them, streets lined with corpses in small mountain towns where the doctors were playing cards, and then what I had discovered in Chile, a sustained fight of the Unidad Popular, where the masses were rising up against fascism. A socialist president had been elected, Salvador Allende, by a united front of left and progressive parties. Chileans had expropriated the copper mines from U.S. companies. After I left, the U.S. had become covertly involved to orchestrate a coup, eventually putting the dictator Pinochet in power. Allende had either committed suicide in the Palacio out of despair or had been assassinated. I had come home to the US a few months before the 1974 coup. I remember feeling lost in a demo about the coup in Times Square, wondering which of the people I had met down there were being shot or rounded up to be put in stadiums, to be disappeared, tortured, or who had fled. What had struck me, nevertheless, was the nationalism that the young felt, for which I felt envy. I yearned deeply for a force larger than myself in which I could believe. And for my trip to Latin America, I found my calling, solving the dilemma of women's liberation and socialism. I had been talking at the ERPI party, the Union for Radical Political Economics, where I had met David, about how women were struggling, beating pots and pans in the streets over the difficulty of procuring food and the basics of living. It seemed to me that socialist theory was missing the reality of women's lives and that we should be organizing around consumption activities and not just around production. David suggested I write a book, and I did. So that's an excerpt from chapter 3. Are there any questions about it or responses before I go on to chapter 4?
I actually have a question for you. What do you mean by consumer activities?
So, Marxist theory looks at how workers in factories and places of work produce commodities or produce services, and consumption is when the woman who's in charge of the household has to go from place to place to buy things. Now we have direct delivery, but since COVID, a lot of people just order their food. But it used to be that women had to go shop. The person running the household had to go from workplace to workplace to gather the goods and services for the family. And that whole sphere of activity takes a lot of time. but it was not worked into Marxist theory, which is what I was working with at the time. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
The idea was it wasn't, we were calling it housewives versus workers. And the work isn't just in the house. You have to take your kid to school. You have to take your kid to a clinic. You have to go shopping. You have to go out of the house and do the work of procuring goods and services. And that whole sphere was invisible in the theory that we were using at that time.
Thank you. That makes a lot more sense now. So I'm looking forward to listening to more. I just can't believe your experiences. You are a very strong person to share this with us. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, chapter 4, my whirlwind photography days. Although my New York City days were the most motivated by vision, my first passionate pursuit had been in the field of photography. In 2023, a young woman, Mia Lazar, contacted me. She was a senior at a university in Virginia researching a project called Documerica. I had applied to work on that project with two other women to document industrial production in the state of New Jersey. Rebecca Schifrin and Julie Baudy were their names. At the time we first spoke, Mia had not located either one. I remembered around 1975 driving through New Jersey to photograph and then meeting with an official at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and being disappointed that although we had applied to the Documerica project, nothing had happened. However, Mia had run across my name in the archives. Since both my first and last names, Batya and Weinbaum, were unusual, she could actually find me. I couldn't remember much about the project she had contacted me about. She settled for asking me questions about other projects I had done in the 70s when I was doing documentary photography, such as families, playgrounds, and children in South Boston, and photographing for textbooks, UNICEF, and the United Nations in Latin America. Documentary photography, my first love, had been offered by a professor named Jerome Liebling when I went to college in Amherst, Massachusetts at Hampshire in its first year, 1970 to 71. The incoming class consisted of 250 bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young radicals. We lived largely in dorms that had been built on an old farm along Route 116, along with the incipient brick and mortar campus. Mia had heard of Jerry in her studies, but to us, he was just an unassuming old nice guy whose always open darkroom area and lounge created a groove for misfits in the community. The college was very student-centered, with academic progressions organized around projects students had decided to do themselves. No courses were even required. The only thing you had to do was pass exams in 3 areas, and you made them up yourself. No grades were involved. The project I made up for my Division I exam was to go to Mexico with other students. All photographers are filmmakers. Jerry came along as our advisor. We were a caravan of trucks and cars. The whole thing had been my idea, and we had fun. I keep pictures of this time in Shulmuth Firestone, my storage and infrared sauna cabin in Floyd, Virginia, at my retreat space for women. One is a Marlboro-like cowboy, an elegant still of a man wearing a large white-brimmed hat as he reads a magazine in front of a darkened sundry shop in the background. Another, a little girl standing next to a table covered with vegetables, and another, a multi-layered brown and blue silk screen made of a 12-year-old girl. I had taken her picture in the back of a truck when we picked her up somewhere in northern Mexico, between the southern border of the U.S. and San Miguel de Allende, an artist colony to which we had been headed. Along the way, we had gotten very drunk on tequila. A policeman, finding us in the full moon lit desert, had told us he knew a free place we could stay. So, taking him up on his offer, voluntarily we spent the night in a local jail cell, chilling out. We were so drunk we hadn't even realized where he was putting us. We realized the next morning when, a bit hungover, we woke up. He let us go without any charges or arrests, and we simply walked out to return to our adventures.
Wow, that is quite the adventure, Batya. I'm amazed. So, you mentioned Professor Liebling. Could you give us a little bit more information about who, because what was he? He sounds like he was famous, but I don't know anything really about him.
Well, he's passed on now, but Jerome Lieveling was a very well-known documentary photographer. There was a whole school of documentary photography which was about capturing candid moments. It
Hmm.
was created by Henry Cartier-Bresson, and that's the method that Jerry used. And one of the pictures I remember of him that he took was of a woman on her hands and knees on a big marble um, checked floor, scrubbing the floor. Uh,
Hmm.
so it was like slice of life pictures, not portraits, not posed pictures, but capturing candid moments. And that was a whole movement, and he was part of that.
Oh, wow. That's awesome you got to have that experience. So, oh, and I have a question from Jackie actually. Batia, why did you decide to write a memoir? And how does it capture your voice? And
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to leave the discussion to memoirs at the end, but that's a good question, Jackie. Thanks for asking. So I've been living in this house that I bought in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, when I got my first tenure track job at a university. I was teaching English at the multicultural literature at Cleveland State University, and I was able to buy a house. And I've had it since 1999, and it's filled with a lot of stuff. And I was interested in moving to Florida, where and I bought a condo down there. So in the process of packing things up and getting rid of things, I was like literally going through my possessions from 25 years and even longer because I had things stored here for my whole life. So I guess I was motivated to write the memoir to make a record of the life that I'd had here for 25 years and to preserve this fascinating history, which had been around in objects and letters and pictures and but the whole story hadn't been told. And also many years over the years, many times people had said I should write a memoir and I never did. So I finally started it about a year ago, June, I started it.
she actually has another question. I know we're going to go to the main Q&A, but it is kind of interesting as you're moving along to each section to have a question or two. But
Yeah.
she was wondering, have you ever considered fictionalizing your experiences in a novel? I was wondering the same.
So I have actually written a lot of fiction. I wrote The Nightmares of Sasha Weitzwoman, which took place in Jerusalem. And when I wrote it when I was in and out of graduate school. It took me about 20 years to write, not to get through graduate school, but to write the whole novel. And that I was fictionalizing my experience. I've also published a collection of short stories, which was all fictionalization of various experiences. Um, and it was called The Island of Floating Women, and it was published in 1992 by Closer and Fever Press. And before, I had also wrote about the experience of taking over my grandfather's apartment when he died in Brooklyn, and it was called Babka in Brooklyn, and it was in a collection of magical realism by women, edited by Susanna Sturgis. So I've done a lot of fictionalization of my experience, but not this. This is a memoir.
Well, thank you. Definitely read the next one. I'd love to hear more.
Okay. So I'm just taking an excerpt from 3, 4, 5. Now I've got chapter 5, Struggling for Survival and Retreats for Rekindling My Soul. Amazonia, Floyd, Twin Oaks, the back of my car, and women cabin. As I sit here on my land in Virginia, that's where I have land, writing my memoir, taking a break from all the work on Amazonia, my house in Cleveland, readying my sweet space to try to sell, I noticed how the sacred environments I have created reflect the stories of my life, including my house in Cleveland Heights. I named the house Amazonia to rekindle my strength once I was deposed by a very conservative provincial English department at Cleveland State University for being too radical and feminist. Of course, their critiques were not expressed like that, other than the time two male evaluators from the department came to my class on the beats as a multicultural literary movement. Their teaching evaluation said I refused to teach men, which struck me as odd because we had been reading and discussing Ginsberg and Kerouac. Plus, the course had been requested by a male, and there were plenty of male bodies in the chairs when the evaluators dropped in unannounced. The letters the chair collected about me during the fourth year review process accused me of hijacking committees, dominating and subverting, ordering too many multicultural library books, and not getting get well cards for a sick colleague. Um, of course, I had, but it shouldn't have been part of my tenure review. These slam letters placed on top of my dossier were probably all the higher ups read, so the decision to non-renew was based on lies and hearsay, or a top-down order from the Department of Homeland Security, as a letter was redacted from my FBI file, which I later requested. They had been following me since I went to Cuba in the 70s. I was most likely marked as one of those dangerous professors that had to be purged right after 9/11. The subsequent letters arrived in my mailbox on October 31st. Many other radical professors around the country fared worse. Not allowed to speak unless spoken to while listening to 16 days of untrue allegations and distortions during the mediation conducted by the Union of University Professors in front of a representative from the National Labor Relations Board, I reverted to art. I started by drawing caricatures and a comic book during the hearings and expanded to bright color murals on the Amazonian walls. I have painted many murals on the walls over the years, expressing myself in the domestic space I had owned outright as a result of a settlement paid in the gender discrimination case I filed after the union lost the arbitration. Being silenced by the university had set off deep trauma where I had been silenced as a child. Unable to be myself in my home growing up and silenced about perpetration of incest by my brother, I had withdrawn into art as well as books in the same way. This time I wrote an 8-act play based on the case in this period, Waiting for Justice, some of which was performed at conferences. Excerpts have been published and performed on public television in Cleveland. Um, Another example, do you want to take questions after that, or should I just continue?
I think the questions that I see so far are more general. So I mean, yeah, I would love to hear more, and then we can get maybe to the general. They're not about what you just read specifically. So maybe just read a few more, and then we can get general questions.
Okay, thank you. Another example of how my spaces express the stories of my life is my retreat space in Floyd, Virginia. The space, called Handmaid's Gate, nestles in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Southwest Virginia, 2.7 miles down a long, winding, partially dirt road, a 5-minute drive south on 221 from the one stoplight town. The town had a population of 450 in 2021. In 2016, 2/3 of Floyd County voted for the Trump-Pence ticket. The size of the billboards promoting these candidates was extravagant. Yet Edgar Casey, an American clairvoyant based in Virginia Beach, touted Floyd to be a future place of transformation during the coming changes, recognizing the amount of quartz crystal buried in the rock under the ground in the mountains. In the 70s, people began to move to Floyd County to live off the land. The commune scene thrived, leading to the proliferation of events like farmers markets, art markets, and festivals dedicated to music and yoga. The threat of Y2 also brought many fleeing the cities to try their hand at the game, as did 9/11 and more recently COVID. I began coming to Floyd in 2002 to 2003 when an artist I met invited and hosted my daughter and me. Having come under attack at the university, I decided academia was not a place I wanted to full-time be. Having published so much scholarship, excelled in teaching, and spearheaded much-needed curricular reform at the request of upper-level admin who had created the position of professor of multicultural literature, and then being persecuted for my success, I swore I never wanted to work in an English department again. Obviously, I got over that. But as a postgrad, I had attended an academic conference in Memphis, Tennessee of the Society of Utopian Studies. I had heard participants on a panel talk about the need for adult education in their intentional community in Missouri. This had been East Wind, sister to Twin Oaks. East Wind produced rope hammocks and shoes for community income, as did Twin Oaks. Later, I visited, applied to, and got accepted at East Wind, but we never moved there since the community couldn't house my daughter and myself in the same building, let alone in the building for families called Lilliput. They also had beer running on tap, and someone had posted a nasty note on the bulletin board in the dining hall asking what was the ratio of children to drunks. We didn't want to go, give up everything, and then get run out by the anti-family faction. I had also been out about my feminism, organizing a women's circle, and one of the women's boyfriends had gotten upset. As I was losing my job at the university, I attended a community conference at Twin Oaks in Louisa, Virginia, looking for an intentional community on which I could raise my daughter. By this time, I was working as a palm reader, having studied the art with aroma in Tepoztlán, Mexico. I put a reading into the fundraising event to support the Federation of Intentional Communities, which had used the Twin Oaks Conference Center to put on the event. I also bid on an angel painting that had been exhibited with the offerings on sale. When the artist and I met, picking up our winnings, we became friends. When the artist, Laurel Song, heard I was in search of a community, she invited me to Floyd, where she was selling her two-story cabin on 10 acres. She had painted a dolphin on the central room's floor. She also invited me to the Big Island in Hawaii, where she was involved in starting a community. She wanted me to sell my house and buy in. As enthralled as I was with Pahoa, I was unsure about investing everything I earned and owned on a lava flow. Um, should I go on, or do we have questions about that?
Not that specifically, more general ones. So, feel free to, if you have, I would love to hear more if you have more to discuss. This
Okay.
is like what you've gone through, I gotta say, it's like a lot. So yeah, this is really interesting. So keep going if you can.
For a few years, I was creating and running a wearable arts business called Red Serpent with my daughter, sending or taking my art to producers in Bali, India, and Java to have my designs put onto fabric and made into wearable art. Ola, my daughter, took 10% of her earnings when we were marketing the shawls, clothes, hats, notebooks, and bags various suppliers made from my art in shops in Maui and at festivals. Ultimately, I persevered in academia. I was largely teaching online at various institutions such as the State University of New York, Empire State College Center for Distance Learning. Then I have a footnote in which I list all the other schools. There were between 2007 and 2016, I taught Image of Women in Western Civilization, Introduction to Women and Gender Studies, Mythology, and various independent studies. These topics included independent publishing, creative writing through myth, and Native American women's writing. This gig gave me a lot of freedom to travel and lasted until the university wiped out its diversity requirement, which had necessitated the type of offerings I was teaching. Eventually, my campus at SUNY restructured, gave the remaining specialty courses to full-time faculty whose load was extended, and cut the adjuncts. Throughout, I started taking jobs wherever I could. Yet we needed an anchor going from one short-term job to another. Consequently, we were always returning to Amazonia between gigs, which included 1 quarter, 1 semester, or 1 year face-to-face brick and mortar jobs, and places such as Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California, and East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Carpinteria being near Santa Barbara, I started to write a palmistry column that lasted for 5 years for the Santa Barbara Independent. I also marketed through fairs and looked for and connected with places to perform and workshop that play about academia I had written. It was performed in California a couple of times. In Greenville, where there had been a small riot the night Obama was elected, we used to go for brunches and open mics where I read poetry at the Tipsy Teapot. Looking for a woodsy cabin retreat, I became active in the Mayor Baba community in which some of the faculty we knew participated. That community had maintained a settlement replete with dining hall and tea house, as well as individual cabins available to rent since the 20s on Myrtle Beach, where the master, credited to be the first to have women disciples, visited. I also became involved with the Women's Writers Conference mentioned before, Women Rights, which met twice yearly in Indian Springs, Georgia. When giving a workshop there once on what to do with old manuscripts and papers, which I was throwing out and burning trying to clear out Amazonia at the time, someone suggested I contact the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture in Durham, North Carolina at Duke University. I did. We corresponded, and 2 librarians came up to see my 50-odd boxes brimming with mementos and papers, which they had asked me to set out around my living room. They went home and made me an offer. I was thrilled. When I had the cash from the sale, I bought the Floyd place in 2014, supplemented from my vending as a reader and selling imports, publications, wearable arts, and art at the Floyd Yoga Jam and the Floyd Music Festival, where I maintained booths in healing arts and offered workshops. My first choice would have been to buy land in Vermont, but by that time, 3 acres in Plainfield, Vermont, where I most wanted to be, cost $50,000, out of my league at the time. However, with the land and housing shortage, the last time I had the Virginia property assessed, it is worth more than 65,000 now. The last time I checked, I bought it for 16,000. The only aspect of human civilization on the land when I moved in was a cow pasture gate painted dark green. Yet I felt like I had arrived. I felt accomplished. The whole idea of living rustically out of cabins came to me when at my second Michigan Women's Music Festival, an international event I had attended for the first time in 1981 when it was still in Hesperia. In 1982, the festival, which lasted 40 years, moved to the land in Walkerville, Michigan, which women had been buying for a number of years. Since the nearest town of any size is Hart, commonly we say the land is in Hart. Women still make pilgrimages to the land after all these years because of the spiritual feel created from building community. It was through these auspices that I became a psychic because I had gone to psychics that told me I was going to be one, first at the festival in 1982. But I didn't know how to go about that. I met women at the festival who lived in Vermont around Plainfield and soon had moved into off the grid cabins where I could get direct messages from the land, the trees, and the flame of the wood stove to recenter and ground myself. Meditating into the flame, I became inspired. I began writing a novel that was channeled. Confused, I went to another psychic who told me I was receiving inspiration from spirit when the images just kept pouring through me and ending up on the page, not conceived in my mind, but channeled through my hands. Ever since, as much as I could, I built up cabins to live in or found somewhere to go wherever and whenever I could. As to this space, the land of a farm was auctioned off when the daughter didn't want to keep the family farm she had inherited. Rather, her boyfriend was more interested in the cash she could accumulate, according to neighbors on the road who were not too happy about new people moving into the once traditional farming neighborhood. I had lived on the second story of the old mill that had once been a food co-op up the road. A friend had helped me pack out when it was time to leave. She notified me when the plots of land were listed at an auction to be sold off, as she knew I loved the road. This was Edna Farber, a poet in the area whose work the journal I edit, FemSpec, later published, and who was a member of the local Friends Quaker meeting. We had met through the local Red Tent that is no longer organized, a loose gathering of women who came together to offer each other healing. This had been inspired by the Red Tent movement that grew up after publication of the novel by the same name by Anita Diamant. I was in Mexico and on my way to a conference in Oakland, and I couldn't come back to go to the land auction. Catherine Verity, another friend whose house I used to stay on in Epperly Mill Road, stepped up. She used to manage my art, imports, jewelry, and publications at Mercantile Exchange, her sister's downtown Floyd store promoting local artists. Catherine went and bid on the land for me. I wired her some money from Oakland, and that was that. I signed all the papers and paid the rest when I got back. Then the whole sale was hung up in legal disputes, and it took some time to move in. On 1.88 acres now stands a wildly painted blue, pink, yellow, red, green, orange art car replete with bumper stickers and images of Shaushka, our patron goddess. This blue Hyundai accent sedan that no longer runs, now decked out in painted weeds and bright colors, used to belong to my daughter. I lived in it my first season. I had intended to leave my van there to live in, also wildly painted by participants in my workshops on painting from the divine feminine offered at women's festivals and gatherings, such as the celebration at Subama, once a women's land near Athens, Ohio, and now an integrated but still feminist community. I wanted to drive her car since she didn't need it anymore, having gone out west. But when a friend drove the car to the land, it barely made the trip. So instead, once through the gate, we parked it. As I had lived in vehicles before, traveling around the country, and even when pregnant in Vermont with my daughter, the first summer in 2015, I just moved into the car until I could build or find a cabin, tiny house, or camper. The idea was once any woman walked through that gate, she stopped being a handmaid to the patriarchy. I chose the name inspired by the 1990 movie I had seen of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. At the end of the movie, the escaped handmaid lived in a free space in the woods after she reconnected with her kidnapped daughter. So the first thing a woman did on my art installation when she came on the land was to add her touch to the car, shedding the patriarchy and making this a creative, free women's space as well. My original vision included a 50-foot goddess of Shaushka, an ancient Hittite goddess of love and war. Inspired by the walkways at Nikki St. Philé's Magic Tarot Garden in Tuscany, Italy, I also wanted to create a memorial walk to women who have passed, particularly of the second wave. I wanted to build an art gallery according to the original 5-year plan, but I have spent years doing the infrastructure first, having women's gatherings, organizing bonfires, and offering retreat space to women artists and writers, as well as to city women who need to connect to the earth, stars, and moon, and young lovers and families needing a getaway space. I was very happy sleeping in the back of the car. I was blissful, peaceful, and loving the I'm free, imagine I heart art painted slogans and bumper stickers around the rusting body of the accent. I enjoyed looking up at the trees who became my friends and watching the birds fly from limb to limb as they sang. They chortled in nature, but it also seemed like the goddess they were singing to me. Next installed on the land was a now goddess painted camper I named Shasta with a portrait of Hillary Clinton and a mountain lion, and nevertheless she persisted, painted on the side facing the road where I lived for 4 years. There's also a bathhouse built by asylum seekers from Central America and 3 prefab pine cabins built and installed by Mennonites. They fled Switzerland in the 1600s to escape European militarism, having split with Calvin and Luther over issues of pacifism and separation of church and state, being direct heirs of the Anabaptist tradition. I mostly stay in one of these, the Kate Millett cabin, which I more often just call my sleeping cabin. This I named after the famous second wave author of Sexual Politics and 10 other books, whom I had known personally in New York, having met her at the West Beth Women's Salon one night when I gave her a ride home. In a second one, Women Cabin, I sometimes boil eggs in the morning and use the computer and printer setup. I feed vitamins, dental sticks, and hamburger to my Chihuahua, Wally, my service dog. I rescued him from a dark hotel room in El Centro the year after my 2 cats died on Isla Mujeres, Mexico, the island off the coast of Cancun, where I had been working as a psychic reader and creating a feminist art installation, Feminina Sube, for a number of years, and where I conceived my daughter. The art installation is a mosaic assemblage of fertility and warrior goddesses and is still there, though I lost the lease to the building during COVID when I wasn't there. Women Cabin is more of a communal space, which I often rent out to visitors. There, women usually stay and congregate when on the land. A woman who used to stay came with her partner and insulated this building one winter. The name derives from the wooden painted bathroom sign, Women, rescued by Autumn Velasquez, one of the local women who used to organize gatherings and send her homeschooled daughter to rummage through the considerable feminist library. Autumn rescued the hand-painted sign from the co-op in Roanoke when the place her partner worked had been remodeling. I named the cabin after the infrared sauna I bought myself for my birthday one winter as well. We had a women's work weekend to set up the sauna. I named this shed our cabin Shulamith Firestone. This was meant to memorialize the second wave theorist who wrote the path-breaking book, The Dialectic of Sex, published in 1968. The cabin also stores accumulated art, books, and stuff. The bathhouse doesn't have a name, being the newest installation. We finished this structure in fall 2022. What an addition to be able to run hot water in a sink and wash dishes, as well as to take hot showers and baths when I clear out the flies, mice, and wasps. Also, I put in a well, pump, electricity, propane, Wi-Fi, a compost area, water catchers, a gravel driveway, no toilet in the bathhouse until 2023. But after 9 years now, actually it's 10 now. I consider the place very built up. Do you want me to finish the chapter or stop?
Actually, let's go ahead and go to some questions since we only have 10 more minutes.
Okay.
These questions, first of all, your book is fascinating. Like your life, I'm not joking, it's fascinating. But okay, so let's go with Jackie. I'm going to go with our second question. I'll come back to the other ones, Jackie. But so where did you have the most freedom to voice your experiences, memoir or novel? What do you think?
I'm thinking, first of all, you can get the memoir online at femspec.org if you really want to, and thank you for your compliments. Um, what's the question again? Where did I have my most freedom to?
Voice, do you feel like it's more with your own personal novel, or do you feel like you have more freedom to voice about your experiences through the novel or through a novel, I guess a fictional novel, or your own memoir?
My memoir is more my own direct voice. When I wrote the novel that took place in Jerusalem, I was very much about recording the spirit of place and surroundings and other giving voice to other people's opinions because I was wanting to write about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I wasn't telling the story of my life. The story of my life was that of one character in the novel who was encountering all these other characters whose also their stories were told. Um, if you put Sasha's Harlem into a search engine or the Nightmares of Sasha Watts Woman in My Name, you can find excerpts of that fiction and see what I mean. It was about the other people. It wasn't just about me.
Thanks. And so I have a question from Lindsay Ryan, and it's a couple of questions. So I'll just ask you the first one, and then I'll give you the second one. Batya, how do you start the process of putting it all on paper? Like, how did you start with this?
Well, I had a computer that I went to every day to do my online teaching. And so wherever I go, I have a computer office set up. So I was in my house in Cleveland Heights. I can read that part. If people are interested, there's a section about starting to write the memoir. But I was in the middle of chaos and I wanted to make order. So the order that I made was in the pages of this book. So I started telling a narrative of the objects around me. Um, a letter, um, and the memoir was interspersed with the present moment of packing up and getting rid of the house and organizing to move to Florida, and the history told through the objects that I was encountering. So it was a back and forth, and my voice almost seemed necessary to me to keep myself from disappearing. And it allowed me to let go of some of the objects and send them off to archives. And, you know, I sent lots of stuff to places. My work is collected in different archives, so I was able to get rid of stuff without throwing it out. I was able to make a donation to the battered women's or the rape crisis center here because they had a new building and they needed art. So because I recorded everything in the book, I was able to let go of many of the objects that I had kept myself surrounded with to tell the story of my life. So once I started telling the story of my life, it went very fast because the more I wrote the story, the quicker I could release things in my house. So
Wow.
I don't know if that answers the question, but
Well, that was an interesting question. So, did you have to fight decision? This is from Lindsay Ryan again. Did you have to fight decision paralysis when starting to write your memoir? Do you think?
well, the opening is actually about starting to write the memoir. Um, why don't I just read a couple pages of that?
Okay, yeah, we have 6 more minutes, and
Oh,
we have one more question too, but yeah, if you can.
that's okay. Let's do the questions. That's more important. But what was the question again?
Did you have to fight decision paralysis when starting to write your memoir?
So the reason I wanted to read this is because it was about how many times I started to write a memoir and then I got blocked
Mhm.
because there were things in my life that I didn't want to admit. And
Oh my.
so I had to get over that. That was my paralysis. And thinking there wouldn't be an audience as well was a paralysis.
Well, I mean, this goes along with what I was just thinking. This is from Ann Kennedy. Was it a challenge to contain all of your amazing experiences into book length? That's a great question.
Well, actually, I wrote another memoir about the actual process of losing that job. So that I mentioned here. And this ended at page 79. And I intend to write another installment because the narrative, first of all, the narrative was interrupted by the war in Israel because I felt like my own voice was silenced by what was going on in the world that was more important. And also, I moved into a condo, and the place around me didn't express who I was anymore. So I kind of lost my creative voice and just went into proofing and editing. And I thought I was doing that in order to continue writing. And then I realized that this was a book in itself and I needed to do another installment at another time, which is okay because people don't like to spend a lot of money on books. And my Jerusalem novel was like 583 pages. So this is just 79. You can get it and read it and then wait for the next one.
That's a great length too for students. Like, does anyone else have any questions? I have a couple. We have a few more minutes left, about 4 more minutes left. Okay, well, I was going to say you went to a lot of different, you've taught at a lot of different schools. And did that help you expand some of your knowledge and your, because it seems like your focus was on women and trauma. And so I found that fascinating. I was wondering if that helped you get through some of your experiences, all those teaching experiences that you had.
Oh, it always helps me to teach. It always helps me to teach no matter what I'm teaching. I like helping other people find their voice and do better at writing because that's how I came of age, was finding my voice and making myself into a writer. So I like passing that on. I like the interchange with students. I taught, mythology. I taught women in art and made art in the classroom with the students. I love teaching American realism and world literature here at Apple.
Hmm.
I was very excited about teaching a magical realism course because I write magical realism, but then it was canceled because I didn't have any students. So, yeah, without my teaching, I don't think I would be able to go on because I'd just be sunk in myself.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, teaching is such a big part of my life. And then I remember you were talking about the cars and how I just found that fascinating. And I was wondering, how did you come up with that idea? That was a great idea. At the very end, you talked about the car that you were building and women could add to it. I thought that was fascinating.
Uh, how did I come up with the idea of making a
Yeah,
memoir?
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
we situated like right at the gate, and we needed to have something to mark the entrance onto the property. So
Hmm.
I don't know, it just happened. I had a lot of paints with some reason. I was painting a lot, and I wanted to paint the goddess on the car, and then whoever came, I just invited them to paint on the car too. I used to have a van, and I drove around and gave workshops on painting from the Divine Feminine at various women's music festivals, and I would always put out the paints after the workshop so people could add to the van. So I already had that process happening with another vehicle that was like an art car that went to festivals. And then when the art car was in parking lots, like at gas stations or supermarkets, people would come up and talk. And so I gave them paints too. It became a collective art project. So I'd already done one collective art project. I did another one in Mexico, which was a mosaic project, which anyone who came along could work on the project. And I liked the idea of interacting and bringing out the art, the little bit of artist in everybody.
Hmm.
This idea that you have to be an artist versus the rest of the world. And I liked sharing and teaching people that everybody had an artist within that just needed expression. And so it became a fun thing for people to do when they
Yeah,
hit, yeah.
that sounds so fun. Yeah.
But
Well,
you can still come paint on it if you want to come to.
where is it?
Floyd, Virginia is in the southwest corner of Virginia. It's down
Uh-huh.
81 and a little over from 77. It's near the intersection of 77 and 81.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, I guess we're coming to the end of the hour. I want to appreciate you so much for sharing so much, Batya. It was fascinating. You've been through a lot. Very, very fascinating life.
Thank
I appreciate everyone for attending this session, and thank you, Batya, again. And this is a good time for a short break as the next session. I believe there might be another session. I'm not quite sure. Is there another one coming up at 12?
No, at 12:15.
Okay, great. Well, then this is a great time to continue the discussion. And there is a Zoom location, and I will be there. Batya will be there. And if you'd like to continue to,
Now we're supposed to go to that link that was in the chat that you
yep,
sent. Okay.
yep, it's on the very end. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And we'll head over to the other chat.